guess there was nowhere to go but up. He says before the 2024 election cycle starts. Don't get me started. But things are really good. We've been on the road with this movie, and finished up Zappa and Showbiz Kids. God, I mean, when I spoke to you last, that was a crazy year for me. So I had Zappa, Showbiz Kids, and Bill and Ted 3 all came out. Yeah, in the thick of COVID, which was bananas. But they all did really well. So it was a strange kind of bittersweet thing because you felt almost guilty for succeeding in such a horrendous period of time. But if it's any consolation, it was horrendous for me too. we were all stuck at home, and it was a terrible time and worried about whether or not we were going to die.
Alex, I've been in therapy, and I'm finally passing the point in my life where I can derive pleasure from other people's suffering. So I'm sorry.
Right. Oh, good for you. Well, you have I'm going to have to get that therapist number then. So it's been good. We've been very busy. We made this film. We've been on the road with it, and we've been showing it in theaters around the country and around the world. I just came back from the UK. And we've been having these amazing sold-out shows all over the place. So I couldn't be more grateful that the film is connecting with people. And we are about to come out, on digital, so many more people will be able to see it. So I can't complain. Things are good.
For a project like this, is this something that was already, I guess, gestating prior to the pandemic?
Yes and no. I mean, I've been looking to make another tech doc that examines where we are now. This is my fourth feature doc on technology, and I've made some shorts around sort of the growth of online communities and where they, crash into politics and other issues. But with this one, Gail Ann Hurd, the producer, literally cold called me, having seen my other tech docs, and asked me if I was interested in collaborating with her on a film about YouTube that she had some access, and she assumed I would have access, and I did. I know a lot of people in that space. So we conspired to work on it together. It felt like the right time to look at Google, which is really what you end up doing when you look at YouTube, because Google really owns and runs YouTube. And it felt like the right time to step in on what is now inarguably the largest online community on the planet by a ways.
What were your YouTube connections previously?
Well, I came up in the internet early in the mid '80s, pretty vigorously, and made a lot of connections in that space around that time, and with different people, some of whom came to be known as the cypherpunks, and other people who were, this was pre-web, so this was dealing with the BBS and Usenet era, and people who were interested in all kinds of things, including radical politics and art and philosophy, things like that, which, you and I spoke about my Deep Web film about the Silk Road, and that was a very natural extension of this community. Even, taking with the crime element aside, though there was crime in the BBS era, it was much smaller. So this has been a great interest of mine for a long time, and as I've made films in this space, including the film about the rise and fall of Napster, I made a lot of connections. And just like Hollywood, the tech community is very small. In terms of who's actually doing anything. So knowing Sean Fanning and Sean Parker and the VC angel investors who funded Napster and Google and Yahoo and Facebook and all the rest of it, these are all people I know. So it's not difficult for me to make phone calls and get direct connections. What can be more difficult is determining who I really want to talk to, like who has a story to tell, which is, access is meaningless if there's no reason to stick someone in the film other than they're famous. So that became kind of the challenge, is like, who do I really want to talk to in this space? And there wasn't a lot of people I really wanted on camera. Most of them I was just talking to for research.
You cast a pretty wide net when you're starting out regardless. Are there a lot of interviews that you do that ultimately don't make it into the film?
There's interviews there's not filmed interviews, because I don't tend to stick a camera in someone's face unless I really believe they're going to be on in the film. And I think with all the docs I've done, I've very rarely shot anyone who didn't make it into the film, maybe 3 times out of 8 or 9 movies. So I'm pretty intense with pre-production and planning, and I tend to have a pretty rock solid idea of what I want, who I want the cast of characters to be. And it would kind of be like hiring an actor for a film, a narrative, and then booting them out and booting that entire character out of the film. I write these docs very much like a narrative. It's not a script, but it's structurally mapped out like a narrative. And by the time I get to my cast, I tend to believe they need to be there. And very rarely has that not been the case. So we do a lot of interviews in the research stage, some of whom with people we circle back to get on camera later, which happened to us here, I think with Carrie Goldberg. I was doing audio interviews with her for information, and then went back to shoot her afterwards.
What was the plot of the film before you actually really started sitting down and doing all this in earnest?
I think the idea was to tell the story of the genesis and rise of the YouTube platform in order to arrive at the present day and have a direct emotional experience by way of the characters with that platform's impact on society. Beyond that, I didn't exactly know where I was going to go because it was going to be dependent upon what that cast of characters divulged and what we learned in our research as we went. And docs are a strange beast. They kind of erupt and they go in several directions at the same time. Mine do anyway. Maybe other people aren't like this, but I'm going on 3 tracks at once normally, which is research. My research team is delving into the subject and pulling all the media down that they can. And I'm part of that process. I'm pulling down enormous amounts of material and researching. Editorial, my editor will begin to build timelines based on what's going on in this world, and we'll be in the room together discussing stuff. And production, where you're going out in the field and filming people. And while you're doing those 3 things, or because it's me, while I'm doing all 3 of those things at once, a story begins to emerge that usually overtakes whatever you thought your story was. So that happened here. And then that takes you down different avenues.
What, if any, was that big surprise that developed?
There were several. I think that the sheer scale of YouTube really became a pivotal aspect of the story. Just dealing with something that is not a social media platform, is not a record of all of human activity that's been recorded. It's not your movies and your music and your influencer characters. It's not DIY. It's not cat videos. It's literally all of that, right? It is by far the largest media platform on the planet, bigger than all of those things I just mentioned. It's bigger than any social media platform. It's bigger than any media company. It's bigger than most of the conglomerates that own the media companies when you think of them, Viacom or Time Warner or whatever Warner is today, because it'll probably change again by tomorrow. Warner Discovery, I guess, right? So its scale started to really sink in. And the fact that it isn't essentially a separate company from Google, other than, in my opinion, in very superficial ways. It is really Google's media front end. So given that Google is the largest tech company on the planet in terms of how many users it engages with, you could say that Apple has like a bigger market cap, but Google's product engages with far more people than Apple's does, like far more, billions more. So you're dealing with a monopoly that's the largest tech company on the planet that has a media front end that's bigger than any other media front end on the planet. And I was like, okay, well, that's obviously my story. And what is that story? And so as we dug into it through human beings, through characters, through Caleb Kane and Natalie Wynn ContraPoints and Carrie Goldberg and Brianna Wu, what began to emerge was the impact that this company is having on the planet. A lot of good stuff, a lot of great stuff even, I would say, but that the harms were really intense and largely not being dealt with. And so I think that in practical terms, the study that showed that more of the participants in the January 6th insurrection had been radicalized on YouTube than any other social media platform. It was a Bellingcat study that's really, really thorough. We were really digging much more into J6 insurrection and big tech's role in that, and specifically YouTube's role in that. But also this idea began to emerge. I'd been suspicious and kind of irritated by the word algorithm being used so much. And sometimes when you're irritated by something, it means there's more to it that I need to investigate, because obviously just being irritated isn't doing me or anyone else any favors.
It's not very productive, sure.
Exactly. So I began to look at what it was about that term that was rubbing me the wrong way. I would see other documentaries, or the algorithm's coming for you. Take your kids off of their iPads because the algorithm is there. And what I've discovered making the film is that these issues are not, in my opinion, algorithmic. They are to the degree that there are algorithms at play. There was a time when the YouTube recommender algorithm was much more nefarious than it is now. It's gotten pretty tamed. But these are not, in my opinion, algorithm issues. They are business model and incentive issues. They're very human. And so I began to dig into that story. I realized that the use of the term algorithm is in a way a ruse by big tech to get the public to just stop looking at it, to just go elsewhere, because it's an overwhelming, confusing, and at the end of the day, kind of fatalistic term that if you're a citizen at home, you're like, well, there's nothing we can do. Why not? Because it's the algorithm, right? As opposed to there's a handful of people who have incentives to pump this content through and hook you with it so that they can monetize it for ad dollars. And that's really what's going on.
I would frame it as the algorithm, having potentially been an issue. Like certainly I've had this experience, and I think a lot of other people have too, where I've been watching something and, during the pandemic, I started falling asleep to YouTube, which I know is not a great idea. And then you wake up and all of a sudden there's like a Jordan
and you're a
Peterson
neo-Nazi.
video.
How did that happen?
I am slightly more sympathetic to like how like young and impressionable people get radicalized. But I think maybe what you're getting at is the algorithm itself is driven by these capitalistic forces.
Exactly. The mechanics are almost irrelevant. The machinery that is pumping this stuff at you there's nothing you can do about that, right? You can go to YouTube or to whoever and say, you got to fix your algorithm, and they'll be like, okay, we'll tweak the algorithm. When that's not the issue. The issue is that the people who have built these systems have built them with certain incentives that have nothing to do with technology whatsoever. They're the same incentives that William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer were using back in the yellow journalism days when they were, pumping knowingly inaccurate, current event content at people to raise money because they knew for their product, because they knew that kind of content made the most money. And that is the same set of incentives that's at work today. And that's not a technology issue. That is a business and profit motive issue.
I suspect that you're similar to me from the standpoint of being like, I would call myself a techno-pragmatist. Like I know a lot of people, I work in tech. I work for TechCrunch. I know a lot of people who are techno-utopianists, and I write about robotics a lot. I read about automation and all these stories around automation taking jobs. What I'll always say ultimately is that I think something that people don't take into account is the capitalist incentive. Because at the end of the day, that ultimately is what's driving anything. I mean, these are companies. So, I'm not going to ask you to legislate all of this and to wave your magic wand. But like, how do we, now that the internet is comprised completely of platforms, everybody gets their content through platforms right now. Is there a way to decouple those things?
I don't think by self-policing that they will be decoupled. I think that, to your point, because I've been reading, you and TechCrunch for a very long time, and we are, as you know, we meaning the proverbial entertainment industry folk, of which I am in all three of the unions that we're currently dealing with the contract negotiations, are in a labor crisis. Like a lot of people in this country are in a labor crisis. And so we have reached an inflection point where the rise of capitalistically created tech platforms that are monopolies have overtaken many former business models and either crush them or not replace them with equitable models and plans for their workers. So my industry is being disrupted, and many industries are being disrupted by this, whether it's by streaming or by AI or by any number of tech-related issues. Even, Uber is a really obvious example, and I relate to what's going on in my industry right now is the Uberification,
the gig economy.
Exactly. Where now, if you're writing, you may be writing on a giant HBO show and still living in your car and on welfare without health insurance, and that is where a lot of these companies are driving towards, because it's much more profit for them and it's much less for their workers, and they decouple the worker from the company in very specific ways. So I think that in the case of YouTube, they've done a good job of monetizing their influencers, but they have very tight control on sort of who gets money and where the money goes. And so I don't think that they are in a position where they're able to police themselves. They've made claims that they're working harder on content moderation, where they've done very little there, some, but very little. They've made claims that they don't allow ad money to be attached to certain types of content, which is, to be blunt, patently untrue. So the idea, which came up even in the White House a week or two ago, when the 7 big tech companies went to see Biden and Vice President Harris and said, "Hey, you guys, we're all in. We're gonna, you guys go legislate AI. Just let us police ourselves. We don't need your help. We're all good." And the government was like, "Go with God. You're all good. Have a great day." And then they made this like super jubilant announcement that said, "Hey, guess what? The tech companies are going to police themselves. None of it's legally binding, but it's all awesome." That's not good, right? That's a terrible thing. And they're not incentivized to police themselves because they have a profit and they have shareholders and they're publicly traded. So I think that long term, there has to be sort of activist and legislative action from the outside, even legal, until they either make changes, or what I think needs to happen is eventually you end up with antitrust and anti-monopoly situations like you have with every other industrial revolution so far in human history.
You're talking about breaking up some of these companies.
I am, yes. Yeah. I am talking about breaking up the monopolies that I don't see self-regulating.
I was listening to an interview that you did recently around this, and you alluded to some of the current attempts at legislation and regulation around big tech, or I guess like innovation, as we would call it broadly, as being, I think, misguided. And I'm curious what you meant by that.
I'm very concerned. Here's my take on this. You have, here and in the EU, you have these giant tech companies with enormous lobbying power and enormous influence on the governments themselves that need to regulate them, which is why there has often not been very meaningful regulation and legislation aimed back at those companies.
Which, to be fair, is not a tech thing. Like, that's how politics works.
Oh, yeah. I mean, sure. And then you add Citizens United to that here, and it's amazing anything gets done. So, yes, this is the greasy wheels of the Beltway. That being said, when you have a company like Google whose profit is larger than most countries' GDP combined, that's a lot of greasy wheels and a lot of lobbying power. So there's not a whole heck of a lot being done there. I think also, not to be disrespectful to some Congress people whom I do respect, they don't really understand these technologies very well. They don't understand AI at all, in my opinion, in a meaningful way. They don't really understand Section 230 in a meaningful way. They don't really understand the way the internet functions, the degree of how easy it is to pull on one thread of the sweater and end up harming the person on the other end that you were trying to protect. So that's what I mean. My fear around the legislation, which I think, the U.S. is looking to copy the EU in many ways, both their DSA, which I know your audience is going to know what that is, and some of the AI regulation that's coming down the pike from the EU, worries me tremendously. I think it's going to harm a lot of the people they're seeking to help. I think they're looking to break encryption, which would be a terrible thing to do. They're looking to de-anonymize people who very much need to remain anonymous. If you look at COSA here, which is, in my opinion, a disaster that they just will. It's like Michael Myers; it just will not die. Like, you kill it and it just comes back like a year later. And it's an egregious piece of legislation that would do an enormous amount of harm. So I don't think there shouldn't be any attempt to legislate. I just think that right now you have a zealous populace that is eager for posturing, right? They're eager. They're placated by the government saying, "We created an AI regulation bill," and everyone goes, "Woohoo!" And then you read it and you think, "Oh my God, please don't do any of those things." So I think they're sort of taking a blunt hammer to this stuff and just trying to bash it all into pieces, as opposed to a scalpel. And my fear is that, especially in a climate where you have a rise of far right autocracies, where LGBTQ is going to be in jeopardy and in danger of less privacy and more censorship and more attacks, and other minorities and other marginalized groups, and then that just sort of fans out now until it's everybody.
Watching it, I was amazed that you got Susan Wojcicki, from the standpoint that, like, I assume that she's familiar with the other work that you did, and I assume that like going into a film, she understands that this isn't going to be a puff piece. Were you surprised that she sat down to talk to you?
I wasn't, and maybe I'm being naive, but I knew that she wouldn't feel the need to say anything that would be dangerous to her, which she didn't. I knew that she's very bright. I knew that she has spoken on these issues in other areas quite a bit. I know that Google, to be fair to them, which includes YouTube, has often been willing to come to the table and try to address issues, even very thorny ones that people have with them. My problem, frankly, hasn't been so much Google's willingness or unwillingness to talk about the issues. My problem has been Google's willingness to take action, like real lasting action on those issues. Like Brianna Wu says in the film, after Christchurch and some other sort of cataclysms that were occurring, Google did put task forces together and attempt to pick these. I don't think that they're just a big black box, right? I think there's a lot of very conscientious people there, of whom Susan is one. And so I wasn't actually that surprised, and nor for that reason did I think it was much of a coup. I thought it was important. I thought that in a film about Google and YouTube, to have someone who's been with that company, both companies from the very beginning, just just to see their face and to look at their facial expression in their eyes, just really what a doc is good for. I thought that was very important. Same with Steve Chen. But I didn't think it was a coup, and I wasn't going to sort of wag my finger in her face and try to, castigate her for things I thought they were doing wrong, because she would never give me answers that would be satisfying, and it would just be kind of rude, in my opinion. So
I obviously interview a lot of people who are media trained, and there's a certain tacit understanding. Well, one, that you do in fact have to ask them hard questions, but that they're going to answer it like however they see fit, and that ultimately it's probably not going to be a very satisfying answer for me. I heard you previously discussing that interview with her and talking about her eyes specific. Obviously, that was something that you got in person, speaking with her. Is that something that you think translates well into the documentary medium?
Yes, I do. In fact, I wasn't there because of COVID. This was the one movie where every single interview I conducted remotely, like you and I are doing right now. I had a laptop. In that case, it was a pretty high-end interview, so I had a pretty sophisticated setup, but it was still monitor to monitor, right? Like I'm there like a floating head next to the camera. I am asking the question. She is looking at me, but I was not there. I can tell you the reason I make documentaries is because you're putting a human face, an emotional contextualization of an issue in front of an audience. So it may not be, especially with my films, I'm not particularly interested in telling you things that you may or may not know already. That's not important to me. I'm not writing a magazine article. What's important to me is to have an emotional relationship with this issue or these issues or these people involved in these issues. And I will tell you that all the interviews, because I've been watching the movie in movie theaters because we've been showing the film theatrically for the last year, but very much for the last month and a half. There's a very emotional, visceral reaction between the audience in this film. They laugh at places. They laugh at places where people are being serious but clearly lying. They gasp. They have an emotional response, and that includes the response to Susan's interview and other interviews of that nature. So to me, it has been effective in terms of the audience response.
I was thinking about this recently with regards to the writing that I do, that like such a big part of what I do is knowing who your audience is and who your audience is going to be. And that's certainly at play here too. Like there's an expectation that somebody who sits down and takes the time to watch a documentary like this about YouTube will have a certain amount of understanding about the subject matter, and that they will be, canny when it comes to observing people in it.
Yeah, there's that, and the fact that that human beings are, people have a very innate reaction to human behavior, even if they don't know much about the subject matter. So it really spans, because a lot of times I'm showing the film in festivals or in movie theaters where people really don't know much about the issues, or where they do, but they'll be surprised by an emotional connection to someone in the film that they may not have liked on paper, or where they saw them on the news or whatever. So it's, I mean, there's differing views of that in terms of what you're saying, and for sure, if you're showing it to a tech savvy audience or an audience that's familiar with the issues, but I wouldn't, I know you're not saying this, but I wouldn't say it's the same as kind of preaching to the choir or preaching to the converted, because I don't think that there's a choir here. I don't think there's anyone who's really converted here either. I don't think that these issues, while they may be getting talked about a lot, have any sense of resolution, or I don't think there's a real tribe. That's sort of there's a kind of all social media is bad tribe, which I'm not in, and I don't think the film is saying that. In fact, to a degree, I think it's saying the exact opposite of that. But other than that, other than the sort of like, oh, all tech is bad, it should all go back in the toothpaste tube. I really think that no matter who is seeing this, this is why we made it. There's an ability for them to have a kind of a new reaction or a new emotional reaction to the story.
At the top of the conversation, when you're speaking about the Usenet days, you alluded to some of the, I guess, kind of radical politics groups that you were in and around. I'm curious how, if at all, the internet formed your own politics.
It's a very good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. I grew up in a pretty in a highly political family that included journalists and activists. So politics was a big part of our daily diet. I don't think it changed my politics, and that I've always been kind of on the same side of the fence. But I will tell you that it opened my eyes to people who did not share my views in a more sympathetic way or empathetic way, unless they were terrorists or hate-filled. But, for example, when I did the Silk Road documentary, and I was at Ross Ulbricht, who was the Dread Pirate Roberts, as I was at his federal trial, and my ability to be in the actual community of the Silk Road, which I was in online on that community before it went down, and my ability to sort of traffic with Ross and that world, and they share. I have human empathy for Ross and what he went through. My politics, in many ways, could not be more different than his. They're almost exactly the opposite of his, in fact, or what they were when he was, a mayor 26 when he got arrested. To be fair to Ross, he was a kid. But having been in the thick of the BBS era, making relationships with people who were very bright and had a lot to say that was worth listening to, but had very different politics from me, was extremely eye-opening. And it gave me a much more open-minded view of what would become very popular ideas, including the growth of crypto cryptocurrency and that grew out of the cypherpunk movement. I'm not talking about the NFT. I'm not talking about the baloney, let's make $1 billion and get a Lambo side, but the political side of crypto, and the kind of radical political side of crypto, and a lot of those players. It allowed me to see them with much more nuance than it would have if I hadn't been around those people 20 years earlier, which I had, because a lot of those same people were around in the BBS era. In fact, some of the exact same people were around at that time.
Speaking personally, something that surprised me in my own life is, the old quote, like sometimes it's attributed to George Will, sometimes like William Buckley, about, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain.
Yeah.
I'm surprised in my own life that I've drifted further left as I've gotten older. I think a lot of it is, being a millennial, getting out of college when I did this economy, and then watching all of the things that have transpired, really, especially over the last, 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Have your own politics, do they continue to shift?
They do to a degree, but they tend, in a way, I would tell you that, to your point, after 2016, I became much more I felt it was important to be more firmly entrenched in what I believed my political views were, and to not be loose, not wear them like a loose garment, but like a firm coat. Because the world had gotten and I lost so many friends during 2016 who either, people who were college professors who fell for Pizzagate, fell for the most obvious and obnoxious conspiracy theories that eventually led to full-blown terrorism, right, and extremism. So things that were the kind of radical late night discourse you could have with a varied group of people in 2015. By 2016, I wasn't doing that anymore. I was like, you know what, I can't. And if I'm doing it, I'm being very clear and firm about my views, and I'm not leaving things open to get pushed and pulled in varying directions, because you could tell after 2016 where the country was going, and then of course it just got worse. And then with Trump, it went overboard. And now moving into 2024, what I like to say is, like, we're not in the rabbit hole era anymore, because that's kind of a quaint term for when an algorithm would, show you stuff you didn't want to see until you became. Now, disinfo and misinfo is the norm, right? Now it's pervasive. You don't need algorithms for it. It's literally everywhere. So you have influencers who are backed by dark money funders who are just pumping this information out publicly to millions of followers. You don't need a rabbit hole for that. It's the kind of the town square has been blackpilled. So I think we're in a much more dangerous time. So to your point, I don't know if it's changed my politics as much as it's made me take my position much more seriously and to be clear as hell, especially within my social circles. I don't consider myself a public pundit, nor do I want to be one. But certainly anywhere that I'm coming into contact with folks where we're talking about these issues, to make it very, very clear where I land.